We ended the last lecture module with a particularly negative and divisive version of Appeal to the People, us versus them. Unfortunately, we're going to have to begin this lecture module with an equally negative and divisive argument strategy, argument against the person, or argumentum ad hominem. The strategy of argumentum ad hominem, or argument against the person, is simply to portray the arguer in as negative a light as possible. In doing so, you're then free to dismiss their conclusions or their course of action without considering the reasons behind them. As a result, argument abusive is really a very nasty and negative argument strategy. The most blatant version of this is argument against the person abusive. In argument against the person abusive, you simply abuse the person. You ridicule them, you call them names, you accuse them of bad faith, you do whatever it is you want to do to portray them as defective. Once you've done that, then the arguer is dismissed. You don't have to consider their reasons or the views that they have, because bad people have bad ideas. Once we've established that negative connotation with regard to the person, the arguer, then we're free to move on without having consulted their actual reasons for the views that they hold. So a version of argument against the person abusive might go something like this. Look, disagreeing with Wallace is just the sort of addle-headed tripe one would expect from pseudo-intellectuals and communists. Now, I'm not even really sure what that means, but it sounds terrible. And so once we tar the person, the arguer, with these negative connotations, we're then free to reject their argument without considering its real evidential merit. Argument against the person circumstantial is a slightly more sophisticated strategy. Instead of just blasting the arguer as a negative, horrible person, instead what we do is we suppose that the reasons that they give are disingenuous, that the motivations they have for holding the view or adopting the course of action that they do are in fact not the real motivations. We supply the story about what the real motivations are, and we make sure that those motivations are motivations that don't in fact justify their conclusion or their course of action. So something like that might go as follows. Sure, Wallace says he likes President King, who was the president of CSU a little while back. But doesn't Wallace stand to gain more by being a bootlicking toady to his superiors by telling the truth? Surely we can't trust anything Wallace says, given what a bootlicking toady he's got to be. So something like that is an argument against the person circumstantial. I remember when I was an undergraduate, I was reading the epistolary exchanges between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, and I was struck by the fact that they seemed to be of this character. Jung would write all these letters about all the evidence that he was trying to muster in support of his view, and Freud would write back to him saying, "Oh, Carl, can't you see that your pathetic attempts to justify this theory are just really the manifestations of your unresolved Oedipus complex?" In effect, what he was saying was, look, Carl, I don't have to take your theory seriously. I don't have to look at your evidence because I've diagnosed you as having psychological trauma that is unresolved, and that's the real reason why you are pursuing the theoretical avenues that you are. The last version of the argument against the person fallacies that we're going to consider is called tu quo q, which is Latin and roughly translated means you too. And this is more of a sort of defensive or response version of this argument. So if someone accuses you of being hypocritical, or they point to some mistake that you've made, you might deploy the tu quo q argument in response to them. Now, I wrote this like a million years ago, and it's kind of ironic how apocryphal it turned out to be. Sure, multi-millionaires like the Donald often pay little if any taxes, but do you declare every windfall in your tax forms? What about that $20 you found the other day? When your grandma gave you that savings bond, did you declare that on your income tax? The idea basically is, look, if I can show that you're bad, then I can dismiss my failings as not significant. And we saw this sort of argument in response to Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. In this movie, Al Gore states that global warming really is a problem. He says, look at all this data. There's all this historical evidence that global warming is going to be a real problem. And one of the responses to that movie was to say, look, Al, your house isn't very energy efficient, so we don't really have to take you seriously. You're just a hypocrite. That isn't an adequate response to this movie, but it was a tu quo q response. It was a, look, you didn't do everything you possibly could, so why should I have to do anything at all? The next fallacy that we want to consider is called the fallacy of accident. And the fallacy of accident really is a fallacy where you have a general rule. And this is a perfectly good general rule that applies across a whole bunch of different cases. But you accidentally apply it to a case that it doesn't really apply to. So, for example, strenuous cardiovascular exercise has been shown to greatly decrease the risk of heart attack. Therefore, people with life-threatening heart conditions should engage in strenuous cardiovascular exercise. Now, we've got a general rule, and the rule is a decent rule for young people, for healthy people, for people who've consulted their doctor, etc. But it's not a good rule for people who've already got damage to their cardiovascular system. That will likely cause severe complications, maybe even death. So fallacy of accident takes a general rule, perfectly legitimate general rule that has plenty of perfectly good applications, but it misapplies that rule to a particular case based on superficial similarities between that case and the cases that it normally applies to. This fallacy is a fallacy where the content is distorted. The differences between the cases where the rule applies and the cases where the rule don't apply are opaque or diminished in the presentation of the argument, and hence the person does not see that the rule doesn't apply in this particular case. The next fallacy that we want to consider is the fallacy of straw man. And straw man is just what it suggests. What you do is you essentially take a tackling dummy, an easy to defeat version of your opponent's argument. You defeat that version, and then you claim you defeated their version. You in effect create a stand-in for their argument, one which is easier to defeat. You defeat that stand-in, the stuntman, as it were, and then you claim victory. So here's an example of an argument that I hear on a pretty regular basis with people who are debating about the death penalty. Opponents of the death penalty claim that it costs more to execute someone for a crime than to imprison them for life, and that's just an empirical fact. Using this sort of absurd instrumental reasoning, they're committed to the conclusion that we should let violent criminals go just to save money. Here's what's happened with this argument. This argument says the death penalty is actually really expensive to administer. It's really expensive to administer because in part you want to have every possible check and balance in place when you're letting the state kill people. And so as a result, it's very expensive to pursue death penalty cases. In fact, when New York State reinstated their death penalty, they went around and asked a bunch of district attorneys, hey, are you going to pursue death penalty cases in the future? And they said, no, we're not, because it just costs too much and it doesn't actually deter crime. Now, it may have other motivations. It may give people a sense of revenge or justice, but it doesn't actually lower the rate of crime, especially violent crime. So what these people do is they take that fact that the death penalty abolitionist points out, and then they stretch that principle out, make it easier to refute by exaggerating it. Using this sort of instrumental reasoning, they're committed to the conclusion that we should let all violent criminals go just to save money. But no one who's a death penalty abolitionist is making that claim. What they're really claiming is, look, if you want to get somebody away from society for the rest of their life because they're a very dangerous person, the most efficient way to do that is to imprison them for life. It costs much, much less. Even though it's an expensive thing, it just does. And so you should do that instead. That doesn't say we should just let everyone go and save some pennies. That's not what the death penalty abolitionist said. And so with the fallacy of straw man, the person takes the original argument, they misrepresent it, usually by distorting an important premise in a way that makes the premise easy to defeat, but isn't consistent with the arguer's original intent, and then they defeat that weakened argument and claim victory.